We're now going to begin our first panel on big data. A couple of logistical things as we get into the day. I wanted to make sure you're all aware there's a career fair across the lawn at Copley Hall from 11:30 to 1, and you're all invited to go, especially during the lunch hour, so especially for students. Also, in terms of how we will handle questions and answers for this panel, as you probably are now aware, there are index cards that are available to you, and if you don't have one and you want one, I guess you can raise your hand and it should be brought to you. We're going to ask you to write your questions down, although there's also the option of tweeting them if I get the hashtag right, and I can be corrected here if I get it wrong, but it's, I think, NGA@GU for if you want to gamble and tweet. But otherwise, we will take your questions through index cards. We have a guest moderator, Amanda Ziadeh from Corporate CIO magazine, will be our moderator. And she has a distinguished panel of some Georgetown professors, as well as others with a lot of different experiences and backgrounds. Dr. Stacy Dixon, Deputy Director of the Intelligence Advanced Research Projects Agency. Eric Schvimmer, CTO of Bloomberg Media. Dr. Cary Shiffman, founder of Giant Oak and here at Georgetown. And Dr. Anthony Vinci, Director of Plans and Programs at the National Geospatial-Intelligence Agency. So again, from CovernmentCIO, let me present Amanda Ziadeh to get things going. Thank you.
Thank you so much. All right, so our topic today is big data. Every day we produce 2.5 quintillion bytes of data, and by 2020 that number is supposed to reach 44 zettabytes total amount of data collected. So that's a very large number, so it's no surprise that all agencies are struggling to tame the data deluge. And there are a couple of approaches that agencies, organizations can take in successfully gleaning insights from these massive amounts of information. So my first question for the panel is, please start by asking how you approach big data in your respective organizations. Would you like to start, Mr. Schvimmer?
I guess I'll start. I might be the answer to a Sesame Street question, which is which one of these things doesn't look like the others. So at Bloomberg, our information varies, quite frankly, depending on the line of businesses. Ranges from less sensitive data, which I deal with, quite frankly, in a lot of what I do in the media organization, although there is a lot of personally identifiable information there, to very sensitive data as to what our customers are doing on our platform, both from trading aspects, et cetera. So depending on those different classifications, really that helps determine what we do and don't do with that data. And there's, as we start to harvest this in more centralized locations, there's a lot of different concerns that come up with that. And I don't know that I know all the answers to that, but we're taking a very slow approach to what we do, maybe to a disadvantage in some ways from a competitive standpoint, just to ensure that our customers' privacy is at the forefront of everything we do.
So at IARPA, we are the advanced research arm for the intelligence community. And as you might imagine, the data sources can range anywhere from the classified to the open source. We have some programs that are really looking at what can you do with the information that's out there publicly available to learn and try to forecast events that are happening, whether it's geopolitical events or disease outbreaks, to the other end of data that we actually create so that we can better train algorithms that we're using for machine learning purposes to be able to automate more of the, whether it's 3D model generation, whether it is being able to do more with sort of the DNA that's out there that we can actually use well, I'll talk a little bit more about that one a little bit later, but being able to take data sources that are as large as things like being able to have someone's human genome and being able to understand what's in the genome and how to translate that and correlate it with other factors. So there's quite a number of things that we do with different types of data, but having access to it is extremely important, and when we can't have access to it, we do try to create it and then try to make it available to researchers and the public to use after we're done with it as well.
Thanks. And thanks to NJ and Kalaris for hosting and having us here. The way I think about big data is it's observations, and for me it's observations of human behavior. So if you think about science and scientific method, you want to observe, take good notes so you can understand a phenomenon and understand how that is going to play out in the future. Humans are particularly complex, so if you're a physicist, it's somewhat easier. I'm a behavioral scientist, so I think physics is easier. I think human behavior is complex. This world of big data that Amanda opened with is an opportunity for scientists to better observe human behavior, better understand human behavior, make sense of human behavior. You can do that if you're in the commercial world and you want to sell online ads, that's great. If you do counterterrorism or counter-human trafficking for a living, it's also incredibly helpful. So the big data world has tremendous promise for us because it helps us to better understand human behavior.
Thank you for having me. When I think about the agency, NGA, and I think about data, kind of take a step back and think about what we really do as an intelligence agency and what intelligence is really about. And to me, and I'm naive to it because I'm 8 months into being a government employee, it's really about providing information to decision makers to make a decision. And that might be a soldier in Iraq or Afghanistan deciding what door to go in, and that might be a president deciding what to do about a massive national security issue. And to get to that information, data is the raw material that we use, and there's a spectrum of data types and sources that we have to address, and I think that we have essentially a duty to use all of those types of data and whatever data is available. We can't leave data on the table, and traditionally, the NGA has been focused on some particular types of data. So think satellite imagery, in particular classified satellite imagery. But there's lots of data sources now that would come into the bucket of geospatial data sets that we now have to use. And many of those data sets are large, to say the least, very large, petabytes and petabytes, and not just coming from government sources any longer, but also coming from commercial sources. And the emerging commercial space industry in particular is a game changer for what we're doing. And that leaves us in a position where we have to figure out essentially how to use that data across all use cases, so storage, dissemination, analysis, and so forth. And there are challenges within each of those areas, and not only that, the amount of data hasn't sort of plateaued. It's continuing to go up, I think I would suggest, even more rapidly. And that means that our solutions for how we're going to use that data has to accelerate in how fast we're adopting those solutions. And those are really the types of challenges that we have within the agency, but really the opportunities. Because again, those data sources are the things that give us the information that we provide to those decision makers.
Right, so branching off of that, what are the problems that each of you are trying to solve with big data? And on the other hand, what are the challenges the rise of big data is bringing into your organizations?
Wow, so lots of challenges, but from a business standpoint, I'll just try to zero in because I could probably take the whole hour up if I talked about all the different ones we had within our organization. Some of the ones that we're looking at, much like what the other panelists just spoke about, is how can we provide a better experience, right? There's crass business things we could be doing with it, and quite frankly, they're not at the bottom of the list either. But overall, what can we do to make your use of our products better? So there's 40,000 functions on a Bloomberg Professional product, over 40,000 functions. Nobody's going to learn all those. So if we understand from patterns of how you use the product, what are the ones that are most relevant? And by the way, even the ones that are related to the ones that you use, maybe we can put those in within a stream of relevance. Those are things that make sense to our product. From a media standpoint, you've heard most of what goes on out in the within the internet websites, understanding how people are using your site's recommendations, but more importantly, being able to surface things that are much the same use case related to what you might do. And also, as we look towards our media side of the business, there is an advertising component The advertising model of just throwing pure banner ads at you or pure ads with no relevance to you is kind of going, or if it's not, it certainly will be very soon. So the real value is both to advertisers as well as the person consuming those is to be a little bit smarter about that. And also when you're starting to work with advertisers themselves, they want to understand, they're really into micro-targeting capabilities these days, making sure that they can find people who are really either interested in their product or soon will be. So those are different types of use cases. And like I said, I could go on for a while, but I'll let some of you guys speak.
I'll talk about two specific research programs that we're working on. So one I mentioned is looking at the open source data. And with this particular one called Open Source Indicators, it's actually a completed program that has transitioned. But the point of the program, and this one started over 5 years ago when we were still trying to understand within the intelligence community, what is the value of this open source data? This particular one had 30,000 different streams of data to include many social media sites, to include things like reservation systems, trying to understand whether you could use this data to figure out that there is a geopolitical event, there is a protest, there is some sort of something that's going to destabilize a country happening just based on what people are talking about, or that there's a disease outbreak based on the number of, say, searches on particular symptoms, or even cancellations for restaurant reservations ended up being an indicator. That's one end of it, and that's not data that we create, but it's data that we need to have access to. And then one of the challenges of this, unfortunately, is, and I think we're going to talk a little bit about privacy later, but I'll just sort of do a bit here. This data is publicly available or purchasable. However, as much as many people love putting their data out into the world for anyone to use, it's sort of anyone but the government. There's this strange, very strange phenomena where there's some sort of, it can be used by anyone else. It can be used to target me for sales. It can be used to target me for something else based on where I am and what my preferences have been shown. But don't let the government say that they would like access to the same data that's already out there. That becomes a problem, not only for our ability to use that data to keep this country safe, but it also just doesn't quite make sense logically. I understand privacy concerns and the need to protect the data, but if you're disadvantaging the people that are trying to keep this country safe by not allowing them to have data that everyone else has access to, there's something there that we need to address. And we'll talk about that because clearly there is a lack of trust that we need to work on as the government towards the public, and that is something that we're trying to do with transparency. But that's probably the biggest source of data we want to use is the open source data, and the biggest challenge with using it is not having access to what many others already have access to.
So I think the challenge of this massive growth in data is the same as the opportunity, which is more data can't lead to more work. More data has to lead to less work, right? So as the volume of, so you've got analysts, you've got 100 analysts or investigators or folks working for you, and if over 2 years the amount of data in the world doubles, do you need to double the number of analysts, right? That can't be right. So what we need to do is we need to take this proliferation of data and develop automation, artificial intelligence, ways in which the same number of people can go through more and more data. So I think the biggest opportunity with big data is the biggest challenge, which is that more data can't lead to more work. The second challenge of data, and I'll give an example in a second, the second challenge of data is that hard to find data or that hard to get data? So if you're in the intelligence community, there are sources and methods where you get that hard to find data. But even if you're commercial, if you're operating outside of the intelligence community and commercially, there are increasingly sophisticated ways for people to hide their behaviors and their activities. So we've done work on counter-human trafficking in the open source world. It's been a great opportunity in the sense that in the human trafficking and sex trafficking world, there is a component of this industry that is public-facing. So there needs to be a retail element. There has to be advertising, right? So that's an opportunity for folks like us to go out and grab all kinds of data that would have been impossible to grab previously, and we can get it all in one place, and we can do lots of analytics. We need to do automation, AI, things like that on that data, so that way a small group of analysts can make sense of massive amounts of data. Second thing is that if if the folks engaging in these illicit activities knows there's people like us looking for them, then they're going to do things to hide their behaviors. And so the second challenge, even though it's technically an open source world, there are hidden services in the open source world that we want to get into. And there are all kinds of challenges that arise when you're trying to get into discussion boards and forums and other places where we know illicit activities and illicit market exists. So those are the two challenges that we work on and we think about every day.
No challenges. We're good. In reality, I think it's like every other large organization operating in the country and the world right now, and it's across the spectrum from acquiring data to storing it and so forth. And I think the other panelists have brought up a lot of the similar issues that we have. I would point out one that to me seems to be at the crux of the issue, and that is adopting and fielding the capabilities that allow us to leverage that data into a product that can be useful to our customers, to those decision makers. And the technology part of that is difficult but straightforward. Actually coming up with a piece of technology, designing one based on requirements or research is not easy, but it's straightforward. That is something that organizations like Stacy's help us do. It's the people in the process side that I think are often left out when one considers how to actually use this stuff, to use the data. And on the process side, I think we have to keep in mind when we talk about security, when we talk about national security, we innately have to be conservative because it has to work. And it's easy to come in, and even I came into the agency, and you look at the government and sort of say it's so slow moving and it doesn't work and all that stuff. There's sometimes a reason for that, which it's also trusted, and it doesn't mess up that much, right? And it kind of works, and there's a reason for that. So what's the way to institute a process though that balances that off, takes some of those risks that you need to when you're kind of implementing, adopting new technologies, and do it in a responsible way that you've sort of tested it and evaluated and ensured that it's going to work. And we in the agency are coming up with several of those ways. Some of that's sort of literally creating new organizations to help. We're creating a venture office, and venture is an innovation office. Some of it is creating new cultures. And then on the people side, that's almost even more fundamental. And I suspect anyone involved in the management of a large organization in this country right now is thinking about the same thing, is we have to, the core of NGA and the core of any large organization is its people and their experience and their expertise that they've gained over years and decades of working there. It's the most important thing that we have. We could teach somebody to code in like a year. It takes 20 years to teach somebody to have 20 years experience performing imagery and geospatial analysis. So we need that. How do we balance that off, though, with adding some of the skills, these new skills that are necessary to use some of these big data analytical tools, to accept and trust and have confidence in the capabilities and to be part of their creation and their fielding. And part of that's training, part of that's culture, part of that's setting out an example for the rest of the agency. I'd point out a person in this audience who we taught to do that. We taught Python to our director recently. And I think that set an example for everyone. And it's not as if our director is going to go out and code software for the agency tomorrow, but he does need to understand how to supervise people who do that, and manage them and lead them, and most importantly, understand how to solve problems using data, to make data part of the problem-solving process. And so that's really what's most fundamental, and those really are the challenges that I sort of think about on a daily basis.
Can I just add on to that?
Of course.
So since we're in an academic institution, I want to reinforce what Anthony just said, which is if you don't see yourself as a coder or a future coder, go out and do an online class and learn something anyways. It's so important right now to be able to understand the way in which the workforce is adapting to this big data world is through math and coding. And I see a whole bunch of my students that are here today, and they didn't come into Georgetown thinking they were going to have to do a lot of math and coding, but in my class, we're going to be exposed to math and coding. Not that they're all going to be data scientists, but they have to be fluent in this world in which we're talking about topics related to big data. And I think it's so important that technology over the next 5 years is going to move towards the non-technical analyst, but the analyst, I think, for the next 5 years has to move towards the technology, and we need to move in that direction. And I strongly encourage anybody who has the slightest inclination to do what the director did and do a Coursera course or something like that and learn some Python.
So I'd like to add on too, because you guys just both brought up great points. One of the challenges that we're seeing as we get more and more of this data is how much do we want to let the machines go with versus where do we bring humans in to ensure that what we're doing or the conclusions that we're coming to are actually valid. Because the last thing in the world you actually want to do is draw the wrong conclusions, and especially in your world, that might be very dangerous. The worst I'm going to do is maybe screw up and send somebody into the wrong experience. But that said, it's, as we look at folks, and I know this is geared towards folks coming out of school, as we look at people who come out of school, one of the things that we need to realize is that, yes, we do want it, and absolutely everybody needs to be very technical, but also have an awareness of maybe we don't know what we don't know. And we need to also rely on people with the knowledge of the data itself before we draw and infer conclusions. We have 2,500 journalists around the world. We have machine algorithms that are mining Twitter for things that are going on all the time. And 80% of what we come up with are false, quite frankly. But we do have algos that surface those things, but we still have a 25-person social media team that's looking at the results before we move stories based on this. Same thing with what we're doing with data in other areas.
Yeah. I'll just kind of keep this going for a minute because I think it really gets to the crux of the issue. Trust is core to not just data knowledge, any knowledge, right? And that's gained outside of sort of, personal observation. And even that, by the way, is, as I think as we all know, suspect. And so how do we do that in this world? How do we build that trust? And I think the key point I would bring in there is just because we start to think computationally, and that's really sort of what we're talking about, is how do we think computationally and use computational thinking towards problem solving, doesn't mean we get to forget about the critical thinking part, and doesn't mean we get to pretend as if that doesn't exist. We have to apply that same critical thinking as an intelligence analyst or as a leader or as a manager to the issue, but now in this new world of computational thinking and data, and that's where these tools come in, these thinking tools, to be able to interrogate that data enough to trust it, like you're saying, and to not be afraid of it, and to know that it's just really all, kind of ones and zeros, and it can be understood. And frankly, I'm a hypocrite because I studied philosophy as an undergrad, and I did a security studies PhD, so I really went into the tech industry after that. But those skills, frankly, I think those liberal arts skills are equally as important to have when we're thinking about this. And it's how do we combine them and balance them off towards this problem-solving approach.
Because you're definitely going to need to continue to ask those questions, because as we begin to rely more on the data, and our adversaries know that we're relying more on the data, the desire that they may have to influence the data that comes to us, that we're using, that we're relying on to do things within the country increases. So the security of the data, because we're getting it from so many different sources, it's going to be harder to protect and make sure that it's actually real data. How do you later on know, once an algorithm's used it and made some sort of a decision, that it's the right thing? So having those critical thinking skills is going to be really important. But also knowing the impact of these very minor changes you can make to, say, an image that will influence what an algorithm says is in the image. Like, we're trying to still understand that from the perspective of the algorithm. So yes, the social skills are going to be really important. The technical skills are going to be really important. But having someone with the courage to say, you know what, something's not right here, and I know we're reliant on this. Don't say, no, we're not going to use it because you don't trust it. But trust it, but make sure that you have those protections in place that you can catch things in the event that they are actually wrong.
And yeah, along with retaining and finding that talent, how can the intelligence community work together to mitigate the risks associated with big data, whether it's cybersecurity or trusting data in an image? How you had mentioned working with IARPA and collaborating that way, but yeah.
We're starting to have those conversations. There's sort of this field of adversarial machine learning. How does the adversary impact how your algorithms respond to the data that it's presented? Across government, I think we're all looking at using more automation, and we're all going to be reliant on maybe different data sources, maybe similar data sources, but we're all going to need to understand them better. We are starting to talk across the agencies, and in addition, also with industry, because this problem isn't unique to government. This is going to be unique to industry. Everyone's going to have to face this, and the more we actually share and talk about what we're understanding about the algorithms and how we're trying to combat these things that might be happening to our data sources, the better we'll be at detecting it.
So I think if we go back in time, say 10 years, when we had less of this open source data, and you're in the intelligence community, most of the data that you use in your craft comes from inside, and you love it, and it's great data, and your data is the best data. We're now living in a world in which there's so much more data that's outside of your firewall, outside of your enterprise. And I think that's the first thing the intelligence community has to get their arms around, which is there's exquisite data that we didn't generate, that we didn't own, that lots of other people have access to. And how do we deal with that? How do we adapt in that world? But that goes back to what Stacy was just saying. I think all data are biased. Right? You don't hear that very much. People don't tell you that. I'm telling you, all data are biased. There's no such thing as an unbiased data set. Your job is to figure out what are the biases in the data in front of you. If you can figure that out, then you can apply that human intuition, that human judgment. Right? Humans do value judgments. Computers don't do value judgments. Humans do those. Right? So you have to have that critical thinking and thinking about what process generated the data that ran through my algorithm, that ran through my automated process. Think about the data, where it came from, how the data were generated, and then think about how are these biased. Eric talked about Twitter. Man, we totally overinvested in Twitter analytics over the last 5 years. Twitter is not representative of the world. Twitter is representative of Twitter users, which is different, right? That's a bias in your data. So if you're going to draw conclusions about human behavior based upon Twitter data, you have to be aware that that's valuable to the extent that you care about Twitter users, and you're not getting signals about human behaviors of non-Twitter users. Or if you are, it's through inference, and you got to understand the strengths and weaknesses of your inferences. So biases and inferences are the hard part of making sense of data. It's how you're going to be cautious about not drawing the wrong conclusions from an algorithm that's absolutely certain about something.
I think security is sort of this fundamental thing in the intelligence community and national security community in general. It's always thought about. And so we do have sort of a leg up in that sense, because there hasn't ever been this point at which we haven't thought about the security of data. And I think in sort of abstracting here a little bit, but I think what I see happen is the problem and the solution end up sort of being the same thing. And you think about intelligence 50 years ago, and you think of sort of human intelligence and spy versus spy and this kind of thing, right? The way that you ensured the security of your human intelligence was you used human counterintelligence. And so I suspect that what's going to be fundamental to data security is going to be data. And we're going to need data tools to secure the data that we have. We can't go back and literally audit by hand through data, right? you're going to need some sort of data tool that audits the data, and then you're going to need to audit that to ensure that it's secure and so forth. And so it's going to be kind of the same problem, it's going to be the same solution. And I think in a similar manner, because a lot of the data sets are commercial and are not necessarily controlled by the government any longer, the solution is going to have to look like commercial security and cooperation as well, which is something, again, that the US government has always done. We've always worried about securing our data, and we've always worked with commercial industry to do so. We don't produce antivirus software in the US government, of course. But I think in the data world, it looks a little different. It means if we're talking about commercial satellite imagery, it means working with those commercial satellite companies to secure their data as well, and that means literally working together, being partners on that, because it's in their interest as well to secure their data.
And I think just to add a little bit more, you know, while I'm not obviously in the intelligence community, a lot of the challenges that we face in the outside world are very analogous to the ones that you are going through. And in a lot of ways, I actually think you're ahead of us. And so the big buzzword right now in outside world is data lakes. You know, what is a data lake? A data lake is a logical representation of our data warehouse. It's bringing together different data sets. So the challenges that come in there are the same ones that you're facing right now, whether it be third-party data or even first-party data. A lot of these are owned individually within our organization. There's experts about them. They're usually siloed. There's a fun bit of discussion about trying to bring them together to begin with. Once you get past that, it's kind of the dog catching the car now. We're going to get ready to use it, but do we really understand it? So in the process of bringing this data together, number one, we need to understand it, but two, not alienate those people who first brought the data sets into the organization, because you're going to need those folks to help interpret it and make sure that we're using it in the right way, as well as securing it properly. And then there's all the fun stuff that goes around access rights and roles and responsibilities as to what data should be accessed by whom and when.
Yeah, and just to switch gears a little bit, I wanted to bring up privacy. You know, and you talked about the challenges of wanting to use those open source data and the privacy issues that arise with those. So how is government able to maintain capabilities with information technology while also addressing the fears regards to privacy? Let's start with you, and we can.
Sure.
go on, yeah.
So there are still a lot of companies who are okay with the government using their data, and I'm thankful for all of them. I'll say that right now. But those that are deciding not to for various reasons, because they're responding to their constituents or customers, or just because they morally have an objection to it, I would ask them to rethink it. We are in the intelligence community really trying to be transparent as possible. We can't show you all of the data, but we do have to create some level of trust where you know that we're not trying to do something that is a negative thing towards society, not trying to do something that's going to harm anyone. It's all for the greater good of trying to protect the nation. And we try to do that by letting you know as much as we can about the types of algorithms we're using on them, the type of reason that we're using particular data sets, to the extent that we can, the outcomes of those data sets. Of course, not being able to share a lot, we're sort of disadvantaged in not being able to create the trust that otherwise would help the communities, would help the country, allow us and not worry about why we have access to these data. So we're constantly trying to work to build the trust by being as transparent as we can. We do have to do a better job of protecting the data when it does come to us. Government writ large, I think industry as well, but government specifically, because we're doing things for the public and it's generally data that is the public's, we have to do much better than we have in the past by protecting that data.
Anybody else want to talk on privacy? Or?
Just real quick on privacy, one thing I would sort of bring up is I think in general as a society we're going through a evolution and change about privacy when it comes to data. And actually, and I know that in the press we think about it, or as the intelligence community comes up a lot as part of that issue. But I think as people, when we think about where our data is going, actually, it's society-wide, and it has to do with companies, it has to do with government agencies, and it has to do with our own personal opinions as individuals in a society about what is privacy and what do we want out of it. And that is evolving, and I think our job in the government is to frankly, be conservative on that. And I think over-preserve privacy. And change that view slower than people want, erring on the side of protecting people's privacy and citizens' privacy in the country. And from what I've seen, we do that. People really take it seriously, and I just want, again, being kind of new into the government, I think people would be surprised the degree to which we take it seriously. Versus in the private sector, where I've also sat, where people take it seriously, of course, but not in this kind of fundamental, ethical, constitutional level that people really do think about it in. And so I think our job is to err on the side of caution and protecting privacy, essentially at all costs.
I think two things are going to happen. So. Everybody here has a smartphone. On your smartphone, there are certain things about it you love, that you download apps. When you agree to download an app, you click the whatever button. And when you say whatever, you are saying that whoever makes this app and who are the intermediaries, they can all see your data. They can watch your pattern of behavior because somebody at Bloomberg wants to sell you an ad, and so they're very happy about that, right? And as Stacy said, I don't care if it's a Google, I don't care if it's a company in China that I've never heard of, they can have my data, but God forbid the US government ever gets my data, exact same data. So we've got this attitude about sharing data versus not sharing data if it's with the government. So Stacy's absolutely right. I have a theory about why that may be. I've thought about this a lot. So in general, nobody here it fears the IRS, but if somebody from the IRS knocked on your door and said, hey, can I just look at your bank accounts, right? Then we'd be like, well, no, because the IRS has authority over us. They have some ability and some power, and sharing data with somebody who actually has power feels a little bit different than sharing data with Google, although Google probably has a lot of power too. But I think it relates to that. So I think that Stacy's and Anthony's answers are right on, which is the government, the intelligence community just really has to work at this. The other thing that I think is happening is I think the market's going to adapt. So I think the scarcity in the market will be privacy here soon. So we've all downloaded all of these apps to our smart devices, and we have sacrificed our privacy. Nobody in this room here has privacy, really. Not the way we would like to think we have it. We've sacrificed so much privacy in exchange for all of these apps on our phones. What if the market starts providing privacy in the future, which is you pay $5 a month and I'll give you your privacy back, and that's an app, right? Something like that. So I think privacy becomes something that the marketplace finds a way to sell to folks like us. The problem is if you're in the national security community, if you're looking for terrorists and human traffickers and drug traffickers, that's going to impact that mission as well. So I don't have an answer to how we solve this, but I think this is one of the most important topics that we can be debating. And I think the next generation, the students here have different views of privacy. The digital natives, my kids don't know what life is like without a smartphone. They've had an iPhone for as long as they can remember. Their view of privacy is different than my view of privacy, and I think we're going to have some generational changes as well on privacy.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. We see that all the time. There is definitely a different generational expectations. And to what Stacy's point was, I think we're going to have to, as a society, start debating this a little bit in different classifications. So there's certain data that I think we in industry would feel very comfortable sharing, but there's others that we're absolutely not very comfortable. And I know there may be some national security implications to it, but look, part of the reason you buy our professional product is an expectation of what you're doing is kept confidential. It's in our contract, actually. Right. We can't violate that for any government, because the minute we do, where does that end? But there's other types of data that we are associated with that we're very willing to share. And some of the things that we deal with, in particular my organization, I think those types of things we'd be very open to doing with. So I think that's going to be a debate that happens over time.
Can I jump in on this? So what if, so you care about your user experience, right? That Bloomberg cares deeply that their users have a positive experience.
Right.
Facebook cares, Google cares, all of these new generation companies care about that experience. What if by working with people in government, we could help you protect that user experience? Because there are certain things that are known in the government about bad actors that might negatively impact user experiences.
Yeah, no, I think we're open to those types of things. I think when we really start to cross the line is when we start getting into more of the, what are people doing from a standpoint of financial transactions, et cetera, when they're trading particular stocks. Because part of the value, especially in the finance industry, is being first. And if you're executing something, you don't want the whole world to know about it, those types of things. So it's not a dead set no, but I think we're going to have to define the boundaries of where the classifications are. And by the way, yeah, you brought up a great point. It's not a one-way street. There's all sorts of data sources that you guys are putting together that are very valuable to folks outside of the government.
Right.
Well, we have to break to Q&A. So I'd just like to close with one question. With the emerging, technology, AI, virtual reality, the heavy use of social media, how do you anticipate using big data in the near future? How would you like to? We can start with you, Dr. Vinci, and make our way around.
I think that the most fundamental change would be something that the director brought up earlier, is how do we work with commercial industry? How do we have public-private partnerships in the future? Is there a world in which an organization like NGA is not just a consumer of data, but a provider and a partner with commercial industry? And this is something that is in effect trailblazing. It is very new, especially for an intelligence agency, to imagine kind of opening up data sets. But I think it is exactly the kind of thing we're going to have to do to get to those types of technologies you're talking about, like artificial intelligence, machine vision, machine learning in general, because I think data is the sort of raw material to creating those technologies, along with talent, essentially, along with the sort of intelligence and talent that goes into the designers of those algorithms. And that is something that our country in particular excels at, and Silicon Valley and all these other tech centers have that talent. And data is out there, of course, but actually in the private sector, data is a expensive commodity and is generally not shared. It is charged for. And so it's kept separated and compartmented into companies. Can we act as an accelerator of development by being a data provider? Because we want to secure data, and we should, and it's our job, and we've talked a lot about that today, but we don't have a profit motive to keep our data. In fact, I suspect that, and I think that in general, the government wants the US economy to profit and grow. So it's actually a good thing for all of us, even for national security reasons. And so can we inject data into the system, into the economy, to spur that invention and innovation? And I think that will be a fundamental game changer, not just for invention, period, but also for national security. It's what we will have to do in a world in which data is in effect kind of a weapon. Data as a weapon is a weird thing to think about, but in essence it is. And we do have a duty to protect our national security, and that does mean inventing and innovating in ways so that we can use data to secure the nation. And we have to come up with new ways to do that as the economy and as society evolves. And public-private partnerships are a way to do that.
I want to use data to better understand human behavior. I want to particularly focus on illicit human behaviors because that's my career, that's what I do for a living. At my company, we've developed a platform that does search, and it does open source and other search. And if you go back to this idea, there's so much data, it can't increase the workload. You have to use more data to be more efficient, but decrease the workload. So what we've been doing is pushing the boundaries on search and using patterns of human behavior to improve search. So if you go out to the internet today to search, you're using Google. So you're not searching the internet, you're searching a curated data source that's curated by Google, that's indexed by Google, and the algorithm's run by Google, and it's optimized for 100 million users a month. If you're doing counter-human trafficking or counter-drug trafficking or counter-terrorism, there's not 100 million users a month in Google, so it's an incredibly inefficient tool. So what if you could bypass all of that and have a search engine that goes into massive data sources and builds your own internet domain, builds your own algorithm, and builds your own index. So that's very exciting to me. That's what we're working on, and I think it's going to make a difference in terms of understanding illicit human behaviors and ways to counter them.
So we're very interested in not only using the new data sources that are out there, but figuring out how to derive new intelligence from the data sources that already exist. But in doing so, in a research program, we have to be able to prove that we actually can make the connection between this data or this sensor and then some other thing we're trying to relate it to. I'd like to see more conversation about testing and evaluating data and their use of data. I think one of the things that we've seen is there are always companies that are telling me that they can solve some intelligence problem. Had you had my algorithm, you would have been able to predict X. Those same companies aren't always willing to let me run a forecasting tournament where they actually predict the future, and then I grade them against whether or not they actually can predict it. So being open to the possibility of having your tools, your capabilities tested and then compared against not only the current capabilities, but other companies' capabilities, so that the government in purchasing, and even in industry in purchasing something from another company, can really say, you know what, this one actually passed the test. We don't do enough of the testing and evaluation, as far as I'm concerned, when we start using these new data sources or new methods on the sources.
So much like anything in technology these days, the only constant is change, and the thing that keeps accelerating is the pace of it. I look back 4 or 5 years ago when we started some of the things in machine learning that we're doing, and a lot of the things we built out around natural language processing and concept extraction are fast becoming commodities. As a matter of fact, a lot of the cloud providers have announced products in this space. So where do we want to focus now? It's on the intelligence of the algorithms and how we can do things with that. And also to some of the points you guys just made. There's macro looking at big data, but there's also looking at verticals and making better meanings out of those verticals. And with the cost of computing now coming down dramatically, we're now able to cost effectively focus on those problems. And that is just such a huge opportunity to provide meaning of this data to our customers at both a micro as well as macro level. And those are, I think, where we're going to focus. We really are starting to dig into more micro level understanding as opposed to just bigger picture stuff.
Amanda, you're about to do now the index card Q&A. I just want to remind people the Twitter hashtag is in your program, actually. On the bottom of each page, it's @NGA@GU. And then over to you, my friend. Good luck in getting a lot in 10 minutes.
Sorry. All right, our first question. How can big data be used to understand and respond to the growing cyber threat, particularly when most private companies withhold data relevant to cyber events they are victims of for fear of reputational costs?
If I may, so we have a program that we started that is actually trying to forecast cyber events based on the data that companies already have available to them. There are some industries and companies who have allowed us to work with them to try their data to see if we can actually help see if we could have anticipated attacks that were coming towards them. It's going to take that kind of partnership and people being a little bit more vulnerable in a controlled setting to allow someone to look at their data before something bad happens in an effort to predict it and prevent it. So we are starting to look at that. The program's called CAUSE. It's really interesting. If we actually are successful, hopefully both industry and government and academia can have a better sense of when something's about to happen so that they can better prevent it beforehand, as opposed to afterwards, which is what we're doing right now.
I will add real quick. One of the other concerns is less about reputation, though it is a part of it, but actual legal exposure. I think private sector is going to be very hesitant to contribute that type of data because of that liability.
80% of data breaches are a result of human error. somebody inside your network didn't do what they were supposed to do or intentionally did something malicious. You understand human behavior, you correlate it with open source behaviors, and you can get a handle on it.
I think we've touched on, the prototype of what a solution looks like is some form of additional sharing while keeping in mind the risks. And I think Eric brought up a really good point. Legal exposure, embarrassment, these things actually matter. And so companies are disincentivized to share that data, and so is the government. And sometimes for security reasons, which makes sense. So we need to think about the issue from a somewhat higher level, I think, about how do we create an incentive structure that incentivizes sharing data for the right purposes to actually lead to additional security.
Okay. This next question is about the acquisition process. NGA's tech is mined in programs of record. Kudos may go to bright Python coder, but where is the follow-through to bring that good idea into operations? I guess that's
I didn't hear the beginning.
It says, NGA's tech is mined in programs of record. Kudos may go to bright Python coder, but where is the follow-through?
The follow-through to coding, to bringing coding to the agency? I'll answer that question.
Yes. Would you like to?
We are, in fact, rolling out an agency-wide program to bring foundational training to the agency, to as many people that we can, so that they can use it. And additionally, to provide intermediate and advanced training to those who are actually going to code for a living, and to not only grow the coders and data scientists that are existent within specific jobs within the agency, so within the analytical community or the tech development community, for example, but to find new ways to plug gaps. Because when you think about data and data problems, they exist sort of across organizations, and that's a new way to think. And that's why I think we see chief data officers, for example, getting that C title and being raised in stature within companies, because it is sort of a corporate level issue. So another way that we're trying to address it within the agency is treating data as a corporate level issue that goes across the entire agency through something what I mentioned before, the data core, and through ensuring that our chief data officer has the oversight and capability to address cross-agency issues.
Can I touch on the acquisition piece of that?
Of course.
So I think what I heard in the question was partly, how is NGA moving from these sort of large programs of record to something more flexible? And I think Director Cardillo did mention Cyborg, so there are some efforts in place to try to be more flexible with acquisition, realization that things are changing and technology changes quickly. How do you bring things in more quickly, efficiently, and then be able to discard them if they're not working and move on to something else? So there's a realization that the acquisition model needs to change. There are tools and authorities that NGA has and is starting to leverage more of, and I think you will see more of the flexibilities going forward. I'm an NGA employee who's on detail to IARPA, that's why I answered that question.
I can quickly add on the acquisition point, because I do in fact oversee acquisition at the agency right now. And we recently had a great industry day where we started talking about some of these issues. And we'll soon be rolling out a plan for a more agile and modular-based approach to acquisition. I think both of those terms are sort of really important here. Agile in the sense, sort of in the literal sense of agile software development, but in the figurative sense that development is an ongoing process, and one does not put in requirements and then wait a year and get that return, but that there's this constant feedback loop. That is truly new to the government. And something lots of agencies are trying to address, and we have a couple of approaches of doing that and want to kind of expand that. And the other is related to that is being more modular, breaking apart programs into the parts that make sense, where you need different timelines to develop the requirements depending on what you're trying to develop. Some things do just take a long time, and some things should go much faster and should attract different kinds of companies. And as somebody who once ran a small business, we need, as in general, to find ways to make it attractive for small businesses, particularly in the tech sector, to do business with the government and not make it such it is a difficult proposition, and they cannot devote whole teams of people to writing proposals. That's just simply not possible. And that's a detriment to our mission, because we need that creativity, this new technology. So Cyborg is one of the ways that we're doing that. Public-private partnership is another way that we're trying to do that. And in general, trying to change the culture to make being a small business in the agency seen as a benefit and a positive thing for the agency.
All right. I believe we only have time for one or two questions. This one says, are you concerned about risks involved with AI?
Yeah. All sorts of risk, right? It spans the gamut of everything we've been talking about over the past hour, from reputational to legal, right? If we infer from the wrong things and use this data in the wrong way.
Concerned, but definitely very optimistic about what AI can do, not only within government, but outside of government. So cautious as we approach it, but not afraid of it.
Yeah, AI is going to happen. It's just a matter of being smart about it. And as I said before, I think the machine can do forecasting and prediction, but humans have to do the value judgment. And as long as we don't screw that up, I think we'll be okay with AI.
As long as Nick Bostrom or Elon Musk are not in the crowd, I'll answer. I think it's. I think we think about AI in the wrong way. It is a capability that supports what human beings are trying to do. It's similar in type of definition to software. Are we scared of software? Software does lots of bad things. It makes cyber attacks and so forth. Can AI do bad things? Absolutely. If you apply AI to doing something bad, it will do something bad. Same for the internal combustion engine. You can put it in a car or in a tank. And I think AI is kind of similar in type, but I think that it is probably the most promising technology in existence right now to fundamentally improve people's lives, and in the context of this discussion, national security.
So Tom Cruise and the precogs, remember that movie? We want to avoid that.
All right, and I think we'll end on this one. A digital bill of rights. Do you think that's a good idea to increase digital privacy standards in both public-private realms, and also as a means of establishing greater trust?
Based on what Eric was saying, it sounds like we definitely need to talk about it more and define what we mean and what needs to be protected. That would definitely be a step in the good direction.
And we've got to, to the points we just made, we've got to figure out that boundary also with the understanding of this has the huge potential to improve our lives, and we're going to have to take some risks and understand that and come to accept that we probably will make some mistakes along the way. Hopefully we're smart about it and we learn from them quickly and we do it iteratively as opposed to big mistakes.
Anyone else? All right. Well, thank you all so much for joining us. Thank you. Round of applause for our panel, please.